Hello, everyone. Welcome to Digital Fridays. This is Adashima Oyo, the HASTAC Scholars Director. In today's webinar, we're going to be talking about building trust for contentious classroom discussions. This webinar is going to be facilitated by Ari Weinberg. Ari is a PhD candidate at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. At the moment, Ari is working on their dissertation, which focuses on the function of rhetorics of Jewishness and anti-Semitism in American culture and politics. Ari asks, how does anti-Semitic rhetoric function in American society and politics? What are the lived consequences of this rhetoric? Ari plans to explore these questions through 3 thematic chapters: rhetoric concerning financial and racial privilege, the appropriation of Jewish history, suffering, and identity, and last, the relationship between dual loyalty causes and Zionist politics on both the left and the right. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Ari. Ari, you can take over.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to my Digital Fridays, and thank you, Adashima, to the very nice introduction. I want to start by saying that my colleague Zara was unable to make it today, so I'm going to pick up with some of the things that the two of us were considering and think are important when considering these issues. So as Adashima said, I'm Ari. I'm a PhD candidate at William & Mary. And I have a background in facilitation and dialogue training through the program on intergroup relations at the University of Michigan. In that program, essentially, you begin facilitation practices as soon as your first year of university, and you work your way up through a series of courses, learning how to talk not only about these issues in an interpersonal way, but also in settings that are large-scale dialogues. I've always been inspired to consider not only the academic components about learning, but also the emotional and mental processes and growth that occur just by being in a young adult. I'm sorry about the sun, hold on. There you go, I apologize for that. So I essentially want to spend this next 40 minutes or so together discussing first some of the insights I've gained, both through the sort of pre-coursework setup, the questions you ask yourself when you create a syllabus, the questions you ask yourself when you choose readings, if you want to have speakers, things like that. Then I'm going to speak about classroom dynamics and different sort of things I've noticed that work or don't work so well in my experiences, mistakes I've made, things I think I've noticed that have worked, especially when you have issues between students or the sort of vibe in the class is not one of trust, but maybe one of uncertainty. And then after that, I want to sort of bring it back to all of us and give us all a chance to discuss things that we've experienced through our teaching in classrooms maybe we've been students in, but also when we've been the ones facilitating the discussion. So essentially, I want to begin by saying the reason that I care about this. And I want to share that I believe we as educators have an obligation to put critical, conscientious thought into creating spaces not only for academic learning, but also emotional growth, especially when we're talking about contentious issues. In my opinion, trust is built in these settings through both planning ahead of time and by processing and dealing with classroom dynamics as they come. So I guess I will begin by speaking on my syllabus and the questions I ask myself when creating plans around that. So there's sort of a few major questions we ask ourselves, whether or not you're teaching about contentious issues, right? Perhaps you're like, well, what's a reasonable amount of reading to assign for a 3-credit class, 4-credit level class? Maybe if you're teaching in a setting where there's certain requirements, okay, how do I balance the requirements of this course or the required readings with the sort of content I think is important? Then there are also questions about organization, right? When do you teach certain material? What order do you go in? How do you build on the last thing you discussed? Next, I think we should consider how long assignments take, how long discussions may take, things of that nature. And another and sort of additional part of that is if you're going to do assessments like quizzes or tests, papers, etc., where do they go and how will they support the goals you've created in your classroom? So when I choose content for my courses, and when Zara and I were discussing this as well, you know, it's very difficult already because many of us are really excited about the topic that we're teaching about, or perhaps, you know, it's something that is required to be taught, but, you know, we have our own spin on it. And it can be really easy to pick too much, right? Like, at least for me, and I'd be curious to hear from everyone else when we get to that point in the discussion. You know, for me, I always start off with this like long list of things that I think are important or interesting or could be helpful to bring students toward what I want them to learn. So I'm going to use an example from my class I taught last year, which was called Trauma Stories, History in the Present, where we looked at generational trauma from different perspectives and different levels. So, you know, we started with sort of interpersonal relationships, moved into structural issues, inequalities. We looked at natural disasters, the generational effects like that come from things like environmental poisoning with Agent Orange. We looked at art and expression. So when I chose these different thematic weeks, there was so much that I wished I could give them, right? And, you know, generally, I feel like many of us really care about what we're teaching. So as I was going through it, I thought really hard about when I assign something. Let's just pick a reading. You know, I picked a section of Amrit Kurtz's Kaddish for an Unborn Child for my first week, which is a very heavy reading from a Holocaust survivor. And when I thought about it, I considered how difficult is the reading level, right? Is it really advanced? Is it more beginner? You know, what level of reading? How emotional is it? Like, what kind of emotional labor will it take the student to process it? Does it have a lot of graphic information? Does it have explicit descriptions of violence toward others? Does it deal with a character or a narrator that might be difficult to understand or comprehend? When I picked that reading, for instance, I decided that because of the difficulty of the reading, in addition to the graphic, intense nature of it, that maybe only assigning 15 pages of it was plenty, right? And then I brought in other readings that supported it, but weren't necessarily as emotionally difficult to process and deal with, especially when they're brought together, right? So that's just one example, but you can take it to a film, you can take it to, you know, novels, right? Obviously, with a novel, perhaps you want to read the whole thing, and I'll get more to how I would think through that if I were going to assign a longer reading. I do have an example that I use from my class that I taught that I think I actually could have improved on. So the next step, which is about organization, when do things happen throughout the course? So for me, I think about the arc of building relationships over time. Often I feel when we first come into a class, it's not like, snap, I trust everyone automatically. We're all best friends. I know all of you. And maybe it will be that way. And if it is, that's awesome. But for me, I consider when I build into my syllabus and choose the content and how much of it and where it's going, I think about where in the semester do I have a guess that perhaps our trust might be built enough that we can process certain material that I think might be more contentious, right? More difficult, more emotionally strenuous, maybe more risky to discuss, or related to topics that might be harder to discuss because of our politics or our contemporary issues. So the example I'll use here is for my course, I felt that it was very necessary to deal with the idea of having competing or complex narratives that come from very different sides of the same story or the same conflict. So I taught the book The Lemon Tree, which is written by Sandy Tolan, who is a journalist who interviewed an Israeli woman and a Palestinian man and their experiences in Israel and Palestine. And essentially the story centers around a home, and it's called The Lemon Tree, because when the Palestinian man comes to see his childhood home, the woman who lives there offers him lemonade made from the lemons on the lemon tree. And he's like, well, that's my tree. Like, this is my home, and you're just living in it. As many of us know, talking through that issue can be really intense for people for so many reasons, right? Whether it's personal or political or both, or maybe you haven't talked about it before, but it can automatically become contentious, right? Because there's so much information out there. I chose to assign that book, I'd say mid-semester, because I felt that that would have given us the time to build some trust, which I'll get more into the activities I think helped with that early on. But also I tried to take into consideration how much background information would we already have, where I feel that people could have something to grasp onto as we're talking about an issue that might be unfamiliar to them. For that book, essentially the goal I had was for the students to be able to read both the Israeli woman and the Palestinian man's narratives and histories and backgrounds, and before judging or critiquing them, really demonstrate a deep understanding of their narrative, whether or not you align with that narrative, right? I think that that was one of the skills I thought was really necessary for my students to come out of when we were talking about generational trauma. And so I made that decision, right? To build on that a little more, speaking on time, like how long do you give yourself? So the lemon tree, I'll continue with, I definitely did not give us enough time to deal with the amount of material I assigned for them to read. And in hindsight, I realized that I should have been a little bit more cutthroat with myself and assigned fewer pages of reading, because as we were going through it, we kept coming back to the same sections. And that made me realize, I didn't assign the whole book. It's a very long book. I think I assigned a couple, maybe 4 or 5 chapters, which is still too much. And I know that now. But I think at the end, it distracted from us being able to put in the time and effort to really understand what I wanted them to take out of it. And instead became this sort of anxious, like, oh, did we read enough? Like, do we really understand the history enough? And I think it created unnecessary tension, especially because that's not what I wanted, right? I wasn't trying to teach them how to read all this history or collect all this historical information, but instead I wanted them to take the book, deconstruct it, work through it, deal with the complexities and emotions that come up when we deal with such a difficult conflict in history. So that's a mistake I made. And now I would definitely have reduced the amount of reading or expanded into the next week. The class I taught was 3 days a week. It was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 50-minute session, which I personally find really challenging as a historian and someone who wants to talk about social and cultural history. I feel like you just get into it around 25 minutes. So keeping that in mind when I chose all of this, I tended to take every reading and allow Monday through Friday to be the time we spent on that one topic or reading, which is a long time, but my thinking was Monday was sort of a day where we dealt with the background, got some confidence in our footing and what we think we needed to sort of feel confident understanding the material. So for instance, we did a reading on how the Turkish government basically has its hands in academia to sort of talk with academics about writing about the Armenian genocide in a certain way. And many of the students hadn't known much information about the Armenian genocide before then. So Monday we spent sort of getting that information. I handed out sheets. We talked about what we knew, what we were unfamiliar with, right? And then when we come into Wednesday, when we deal with the reading, that preparation has kind of been there. And then I feel that people feel a little more confidence in sort of stepping out there and taking the risk and trying to put themselves out there to discuss this issue, right? Like, how do we talk about the fact that the academy is not an unbiased place, which sometimes I think is the information, at least I can speak to my experience, that I assumed before being more in academia and interacting more with this world. So that's sort of a big thing to have to work through, right? I know for me, it was definitely a really meaningful article, and the author's name is escaping me at the moment, but if anyone's interested, I can look it up later. And the last sort of nitty gritty part of this syllabus, like when things happen with assessments, some of us are in disciplines where you do need to give sort of quizzes and tests and things that have that sort of, you know, demonstration of knowing the material in that way. I tend to teach in settings where papers or sort of presentations make more sense, because we're trying to sort of talk about narrative more. At least for me, that's what felt right for me. I decided in this class to have 2 short papers that built into a large paper, and then every student got one Friday, which is this Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing I'm talking about, to expand upon whatever we read for that week and bring in their own spin. So it kind of took away from whatever I decided was important and allowed them to bring in what they thought was important, which I'll also bring up when I talk more about classroom dynamics and helping students feel like it's their space, right? But yeah, essentially for me, I decided I wanted my assessments to build on each other. And I essentially created my first 5-page paper to be a proposal for their final project. The second was a critical bibliography type paper for their final project, right? And then they either wrote or created a final project. To me, I wanted my assessments to support the narrative arc of the class, which was this development of a deeper understanding of what trauma looks like from different levels and perspectives. And in my case, from a cultural and historical perspective. So yeah, I just think, you know, sometimes it can be, oh, I know that because it's X level, I feel that there needs to be certain rigor in my assignments. I think that's absolutely true. But for me, a big question is, does that assignment serve the thesis of this class? Does that assignment support does that assessment support all of the readings, movies, whatever that we're bringing, the speakers, the activities? How do they talk to each other? Rather than, I feel like sometimes, you know, throwing in I've also been in situations where I've assigned a paper because I felt like it would be a good demonstration of reflecting their knowledge, which is perfectly good too. I just think, yeah, these are questions we should consider asking ourselves as we move through the course planning process. Some other parts of this, and then I will switch over to classroom dynamics, are considering what is the emotional labor it takes for a student to process your material, right? When you assign a book, is it emotionally dense, right? I talked about it a little bit, but just sort of bringing it back around. And, you know, I guess I'm just giving your overview here. I talked about emotional labor. I talked about the narrative of the class and considering how your assignments and assessments support that or don't, and how to navigate that. Talking about how much you assign and thinking about depth versus just like over assigning, right? And then I guess two last points I'm realizing and looking at my notes that I have forgotten. So one thing to consider in your time planning that has meant a lot for me in this, as I've started teaching more, is giving myself time and my students time to sort of close the chapters of whatever we're reading, or to transition into the next topic, right? So say we just talked about the lemon tree and did Israel-Palestine, which is really contentious for people. I felt that it was really necessary on that Friday when the students came in with their own additions to the material that I chose to assign for them. I wanted to ensure that that Friday wrapped up in such a manner that the students either felt that whatever was unresolved from that week would be addressed the following week, or giving some closure that gave a sense of like, we're done for now, but it's fine. You know, like we feel good and we're ready to move on to the next thing. And then the last point I want to make about this that I forgot is I have been trying to do a lot of self-reflection as I've been creating my course content about whether or not the material or the assignments, et cetera, that I am assigning, I feel competent in, or I feel confident in being able to do. I know that maybe seems kind of obvious, but I know sometimes partway through the semester, like I'll approach a week and I'm like, whoa, I just assigned too much, or whoa, this topic, maybe look at what's happening in the world. Maybe this isn't timely for this. I think it's perfectly appropriate, and many of us do adjust the syllabus as we go, but I think acknowledging our own process and our own selves throughout this planning is perfectly good, right? Allowing ourselves permission to acknowledge that we're growing this whole time, and maybe we're gonna have to process new ideas or new emotions that we didn't know we're gonna come up upon reading or interacting with certain material. So those are sort of my general stances on the pre-planning kind of stage, just asking yourself these big questions and allowing yourself genuine internal reflection as you do so. Because for me, I never want to assign something to my students that I myself would not want to subject myself to, if that makes sense. And so I really try to reflect, because there are some beautiful books or films that can be pretty graphic, but my question is, are you going to be able to give time to that thing enough to feel like you can really get through the intensity of it? Now the next thing might be, okay, well, like, that's all fine and cool, like thinking ethically about what to assign and all of that, but what does that have to do with trust? Well, in my opinion, it demonstrates a deep empathy and acknowledgement of a student's process, and it allows you yourself to feel confident and secure in the decisions you're making as you do so, so that you can support your students. I think the deepest part of trust is demonstrating consistency and honesty. And I'll explain some ways that I try to do that. And I think we all do in our own ways, right? And by no means am I an expert here. These are just sort of reflections I've had on in my experiences and dialogues in classrooms, just noticing what seems to open people up more to take that next step, to take that next risk, to trust their classmates, to trust me with opening themselves up in a new way. So I think this is a good time to transition on to my next point, which is about classroom dynamics. There was one thing that I think many people have talked about and done, which is ground rules. And that's the idea that before you even start dealing with material in your courses, you give some ground rules and you give your classroom the chance to sort of discuss ground rules, right? So, make I statements, don't take out your phone in the middle of class, all of that stuff. I think that one thing I've learned from ground rules is, yes, like, I just want to give it to the students and let them do whatever they're going to do with it. And generally the way I do that is through, giving a whiteboard or, a big, those sticky sheets of paper, newsprint, I think is what they're called. Whatever style you want to do, totally good. Something that I've learned is that it's perfectly good also to bring in your own ground rules, because I've found, for instance, there's a ground rule that I really love that I don't feel is often brought up, which is the idea of literally like demonstrating that you've heard what the other person said before disagreeing with it or changing the direction of it. So the example I can think of is you could take literally any topic, right? I believe chocolate chip cookies are the superior cookie because this article tells me that chocolate chip cookies are delicious. Okay, great. Now, like me, I maybe disagree with that. I think sugar cookies are the best. So I'd say, hey, Ari, if I heard you correctly, you said that chocolate chip cookies are superior because they taste the best. And your evidence is this article, correct? And then I go, yes, like you heard me, that's my argument. I can say, well, great. Like now that I've acknowledged that we understand each other, I want to add that I disagree with you. And I think that this article says sugar cookies are better and here's why, right? I think that forcing people to demonstrate that they've heard the other person in an explicit way tends to build trust because it forces everybody to listen to each other and to demonstrate that active listening, right? I also think that, I like to try to include some alternate types of theater activities in my classes. So I like theater of the oppressed, games for actors and non-actors, things like that. But when I choose to do them, I think about when to put them. And I often decide as we're going through the semester where I think that they're most appropriate. So, I'll talk more about that in a moment. As as you go through the semester, you're obviously going to have students with very different participation strategies and different personalities. Some people talk a lot, some people don't talk as much, some people don't talk at all, some people are disruptive. You know, I think that figuring out on those first few days what makes people feel empowered in their classrooms during the ground rules. I sort of say, what's a time when you felt empowered in your classroom? And we say, okay, great. Like, you felt empowered when your professor stood up for you when someone said something hurtful, I don't know. Or what made you feel disempowered? Well, I felt disempowered when a student in my class talked over me. So then we can use those sorts of things to put toward the rules. I think often that will help with the coming dynamics as they bloom and blossom, right? Because we can always go back to the ground rules and say, hey, like, you know, we agreed here that we're gonna try to do active listening and demonstrate that we've heard each other, right? So I think that's one starting point to deal with those dynamics. I do find that when you have students who talk a lot or not as much, you can split them out into smaller groups, you can do big groups, you can do individual reflections. Changing it up that way can help. Because I think another way to build trust is to help students feel like wherever they're at in their process, so that that point in their process is perfectly acceptable and okay, but that you're also trying to push them to expand outside of that. So my example would be when I was an undergraduate, I talked a lot and I struggled to not talk a lot because I was nervous, and that was a sort of a nervous tick for me, was just talking too much, not making my point and moving on. And I remember having, in a dialogue setting, the facilitator pointing out that I did that and talking with us as a group about how to manage together, right? So we did this thing where we had M&Ms, and every time you talked, you ate an M&M, and then you had a pile, and when the pile's gone, you stop talking. There are things like that that work, but it's always going to depend on your students, right? And we can talk more about this if you all are interested. I guess the last couple of things I want to say, and then I really want to open this up to everybody else because I don't want to just pontificate for the entire time here, is I want to make sure that I stick to my word when I say things, right? And one of the things I've noticed that really builds trust, and I don't know, this is such a small thing, but it seems to have really worked in most of my classrooms. One of the things that can be a pet peeve is when people start packing up before you're done, before the class is done. And I've found that if I always let them out on time, no matter what, like I hold myself to that, then I've noticed that that behavior tends to go away. So I always tell them, like, day one, like, I will always let you out on time every class. And if I say that, I'm going to stick to it, right? And that demonstrates, like, I respect your time, and this space ends. Like at 10:50, this space is over. It almost like gives a clear sense of closing, and a clear acknowledgement that I acknowledge their time and their stress and their needs. And I think as we're working toward group accountability, there's this difficult dynamic, right? When your students can sometimes be hurtful toward each other or say things that are factually untrue or hurtful to you even. I think that there are ways that we can address that. I know, and I don't want to tell anyone else how to do it because I think it's such a personal choice. But for me, I often try, depending on the situation, to either take it outside of class. If it's something that's inappropriate, I'll try to meet with those students outside of class to talk with them on their own about how they felt. But also often in the classroom, I'll set a boundary and I'll say, hey, I'm noticing that there's an argument going on here. It's clear to me that everybody's really upset about this, and that's totally okay. Like, let's take a pause and stop that conversation for the moment. And I think there are ways you can humanize the people involved without alienating them while also managing. I feel like it's my responsibility as a facilitator to ensure that I demonstrate that I have everybody, I support them. And if I can tell from body language or behavior that things are not going well, it's my responsibility to step in and change the direction of it. I'm thinking in particular about this one instance where in my class last year, a student started sort of saying all this information about the Turkish government that was, that aligned with a lot of what you might read in the academy. And of course, we're reading this article that's about how many people in the academy who write about the Armenian genocide are in contact with the Turkish government. And that is not to say that everyone is, but there are people who have been historically, and we have to think about that, right? We have to think critically. And I just said to him, I'm like, hey, I really appreciate that you've done a lot of reading on this history. But right now, our focus is on this article, which talks about the ways that the academy has been complicit in pushing forward stories from governments which have committed atrocities and don't want those atrocities to be historicized, right? And they want them historicized in their way. And so while I appreciate you telling us this information and demonstrating your knowledge, I think that we should focus on the point here, which is this, this, and this. And so I tried to make it about the class and the material, because I felt that it is my duty to not allow that sort of behavior to continue. It's all very delicate, obviously. And, it's so hard to give blanket statement advice for issues such as this. But I hope that some of my sort of initial reflections have been helpful to all of you. And I hope we can sort of have a discussion here together. And obviously I see most of you have your cameras and mics off, which is totally fine. If you just would like to speak or talk or chat, I would really be interested in it. So the questions I want to put forth to all of you, and then feel free to take time to reflect or talk immediately, whatever, is what are times that you felt that you've successfully made decisions in your pre-planning process that have led to material supporting this emotional and academic growth that maybe you're aiming for? When is a time maybe that wasn't successful, right? For me, that was my over-assigning the lemon tree. And then as far as classroom dynamics, when was the time you felt that classroom dynamics went well, and what do you think contributed to that? And second, were there times that you felt like there were dynamics that were difficult to manage? Because we all run, I think most of us run into those too. And I can't bring up everything I've ever seen, obviously. So I would like to turn it to all of you. And if you're interested in sharing any of your experiences, I'd be really excited to hear them and start a discussion all together about it. Oh, thanks. I really appreciate that. Thank you to everyone for being here, because it can be intimidating to do a webinar for the first time. So I really appreciate all of you being present.
Hi, Ari. I'm happy to jump in and share my thoughts about what you discussed so far. So this is Adashima. So I teach a couple of classes, and one of the classes that I teach is related to great public health achievement. And I noticed each semester when I teach this class, there's sort of two topics when we discuss where the class sort of gets riled up in their various opinions. And one of them is when we talk about the life expectancy inside of the USA compared to the life expectancy inside of some less underdeveloped or less developed countries. And the other topic that we talk about where people sort of, they get very passionate, quote unquote, about their feelings, when we talk about the recognition that tobacco is hazardous to your health. And some students, they say things like, anybody who smokes in this day and age is stupid, they're dumb. And others, they sort of, take offense with that because maybe they don't smoke, but they have a relative who smokes, maybe an older grandparent or a cousin or what have you. And I try to remind the students that, one, of course, obviously, it's okay for us to disagree with each other because we have different experiences. We have different things that we have read or different articles that we have come across with people that we have spoken to that reflect our opinions. But I also try to make sure, and when I'm telling them that it's okay to disagree, that I'm not also suggesting that maybe we should stop talking about this topic. I want to remind them that it's okay to be passionate about what you feel, but to sort of redirect it in a more positive way. If you really think that people who smoke are like, it's so bad to do, maybe you can do some sort of volunteer work about educating people about the harms of smoking, or maybe you can do some volunteer work about understanding why sometimes it's not so easy to quit. So I find that when I'm inside these environments in the classroom and the discussion is just getting out of hand and people are flaring up and sometimes using language that's not appropriate for the classroom, I try to figure out how I can redirect it into a positive spin quite frankly, sometimes it doesn't work. And I
Of
just have to
course.
say, let's take 10, everyone take 10 seconds and let's count down 10 backwards and let's all calm down and reset and let's, start over. But I realize that it's not always easy to sort of navigate those conversations and to keep the trust inside the classroom and,
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thank you, Adashima, for that. I think that you're pointing to a really great idea, which is how do you spin things back into focus. And Azalea posted a really important question, and I don't know if the recording people can see it, so I'll read it out. And Azalea said, as a woman of color, I wonder, what do you think I should do if I have students who think that I am less competent than my white male colleagues? That is really hard. And I'm really sorry that you have to face that, because it's really frustrating and obviously completely unfair and reflective of a lot of our own societal beliefs and issues, right? I know that I'm perceived very ambiguously racially, and I do get some of that, and I don't want to speak to it as like a ubiquitous experience for me. But what I will say is when that happens, it's really frustrating, because I know for me personally, like when I'm struggling with that dynamic, I often feel like, if you assert yourself, people will frame you as unfriendly, or you can get bad reviews, and it can actually be quite threatening to your career. I don't know if that's something you're facing, Azalea, but that's something I know other people that I've spoken with really struggle with. Honestly, I think that there are times when, you're allowed to assert yourself and be like, hey, I can think of an example where I've had, white male colleagues who talk over me, who will repeat my idea. I don't know if you've experienced that. So I don't know. I don't want to assume either way, but I've had them talk over me or tell me that like my ideas are stupid, or who talk down to me. And often, part of it is building community so that we can together work toward that. But often I'll literally say to them, and maybe this isn't the right advice, so someone please tell me if they have other ideas, but I will literally just say what they're doing. I'll be like, it's very frustrating to me that I already said this idea and you're repeating my idea. It's interesting to hear that you agree with me, or something like that, which it sucks that impetus is put on you. It's not fair. And I find with students, I get it a lot, actually. I have a lot of white male students who talk down to me and don't treat me with respect. They will literally text in front of me in class and pretend like I don't see it. And they've been very surprised when I've been like, hey, this is my classroom and I'm not cool with that. Like, I don't vibe with that. And I'm not comfortable with you doing this in my space, and this is our space, and it's distracting to your classmates. And I think this is something we can reflect on more and more together, because it's so dependent on like what they're saying too. If they're being mean versus like behaving in a group, like groupthink, I don't know, Azalea, if you want to speak more to an example, and obviously, please, no pressure. I don't want to make you have to relive anything. But unfortunately, sometimes in my case, I often just literally state what's happening, because that's all I know how to do in those kinds of situations. Do other people have things they want to add to that? Yeah, it's a really frustrating dynamic. And I'm actually dealing with that this semester, unfortunately. I have a group of white male students who talk down to me a lot. And it's really upsetting and very hard to have any patience with it. Your friend, so Azalea said, some of my friends have experiences with what you just described. Yeah, it's really frustrating and exhausting to have to constantly sort of assert yourself. So do people have any sort of last thoughts they'd like to add before we conclude? Because I think we're getting close to time, so I just want to give the space to everyone to bring up any last points before we head out.
Hi, Ari. This is Adashima again. Sorry, I realized I was talking on mute the whole time.
Oh, that's fine.
I wanted to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So in response to the question about dealing with students who think that maybe you are a person of color, therefore you're not competent. One, because you're a person of color, but also two, because you are a woman. So it's a double sort of like you're incompetent. That is something that I have dealt with as an instructor. And I think one of the first things that I do is I'm very upfront about it. Like I tell students, like I know that you may not be used to seeing an adjunct professor like myself who is, young and who's a person of color and who is a female, but that's okay. I tell them, you know what, this may be the wave of the future if more of you get involved in the academy, that our voices need to be heard as well. So I try to really flip it as best as I can and to acknowledge that, yeah, you think that I'm incompetent only because you're not accustomed to seeing people who look like me who are instructing in the class, but I'm just as competent as the next professor. And not only that, it's not even just about am I competent or to be this professor, to be the quote unquote expert or the instructor, but I tell my students, you all too are just as competent. You all too are also experts in what we're talking about. Sure, you may not have a fancy letters behind your name, or you might not be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but because of your experiences, because of what you have encountered in this life, there are things that you know that you can educate us about. And I try to let my students know that the classroom is an equal space. Yes, I'm standing in front of the classroom, but your voices count too. I want to hear what your opinions are. You can learn from me just as much as I can learn from you. So I really try to open up the classroom so that everyone has a voice in some sort of way. I don't know if that's helpful to you, Azalea.
No, that's a great point. And something I always say, just like to agree with you, is I always say to my students, you are smart and capable, and you're teaching me all the time. I say you're smart and capable and you're teaching me all the time. And no, good for you for being so straightforward. That sounds really productive, and you're opening it up in a way that sounds really productive and fruitful and awesome. So I could definitely take that tip from you in the future.
So if there are no other comments or questions for Ari, I thank you all for joining. I want to point out that all of our Digital Fridays, we do a recap post. Usually that's done by the person who facilitated the webinar. And we also record the webinars, and all the postings will be on the HASTAC website. So in case you want to play back anything on this webinar, or you want to share this webinar with a colleague or a friend or a student, we make sure that that's easily available because the webinars are recorded, and hopefully Ari will write a recap about this experience, and we will post it on HASTAC, and we'll share it with the HASTAC community. So thank you, everyone, and thank you again, Ari. What a great presentation.
Thank you so much. I hope you all have a good day.
Bye.
Happy weekend.